They called it a restructuring. That's the word my boss used when he sat me down on a Tuesday morning, slid a single sheet of paper across the conference table, and told me my position was being eliminated. 31 years old, 9 years with the company, and I had just delivered the biggest contract in the firm's history 3 weeks earlier. $62 million. I negotiated every clause, flew to 4 cities in 2 weeks, slept maybe 4 hours a night for a month straight. And on a Tuesday morning in October, they handed me a termination letter with 2 weeks severance and a box for my desk items. What they forgot was that I still had my copy of my employment agreement. I started at Meridian Structural Group straight out of grad school. Civil engineering degree, minor in contract law. That minor was a decision I made on a whim junior year because I had an open elective slot and the class met at noon. I have thought about that elective almost every day since October. Meridian was a mid-size infrastructure firm out of Columbus, Ohio. We did bridge repair contracts, municipal drainage systems, state highway subcontracting, the kind of work that keeps roads from falling apart and keeps engineers employed for decades. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and it mattered, and I was good at it. I worked my way up from junior engineer to senior project lead. By year 6, I was managing a team of 11 people and overseeing contracts worth anywhere from $3 to $18 million. I knew the clients, I knew the inspectors, I knew which county procurement officers liked their calls returned before noon and which ones preferred email. That kind of institutional knowledge takes years to build and 5 minutes to lose. My direct supervisor for most of my time there was a man I'll call my director. He was old school, curt, demanding, not the type to hand out compliments. But he was fair. He knew the work. When I brought in a $22 million county contract renewal in year 4, he shook my hand and said, "Good, keep going." That was the most enthusiastic I ever saw him get. I respected him for it. The problem started when the company brought in new ownership. Meridian had been privately held since its founding in the late 80s. The founder had run it himself until he retired, then left it in the hands of a small executive team with a board of 4. In my 8th year, a regional private equity group out of Pittsburgh acquired a controlling stake. They didn't change anything immediately. New logo, new mission statement on the website, a few town halls where an executive in an expensive suit told us the company's fundamentals were strong and that our jobs were secure. Everyone clapped and went back to work. What changed, slowly, was the composition of the leadership team. The new ownership group had a man they preferred, someone they'd worked with at a previous firm in Pennsylvania. By spring of my 9th year, he had been installed as Chief Operating Officer. My director was still technically above him in title, but it became clear very quickly that the COO was the one with the ear of the ownership group, and my director was being managed out. Within 6 months, my director took early retirement. He told me privately that it had been made clear to him that things were going in a different direction. He shook my hand when he left. That was a harder day than I expected. The new COO and I had a professional relationship that I would describe as functional but cold. He didn't understand the technical side of infrastructure work and didn't pretend to. His interest was margins, timelines, and impressing the ownership group with efficiency numbers. That's not inherently wrong. But it meant that the things I cared about, building long-term client relationships, investing time in contract language, staffing projects with engineers who actually knew the work, were friction to him, not value. Still, I did my job, and in the summer of my 9th year, I landed what became the biggest contract in Meridian's history. The client was a state infrastructure authority in the Midwest. I won't name the state, but it was a large-scale bridge rehabilitation program covering 14 structures across 3 counties. The total contract value was $62 million, spread over 4 years. I had been cultivating that relationship for 2.5 years. I knew the program director. I had submitted on a smaller pilot project the year before and executed it cleanly, and when the full RFP dropped, I was positioned well. I built a proposal team myself. I wrote the narrative sections personally. I flew to the client's office 3 times for presentations. When the award came through on a Wednesday afternoon in August, I got the call at my desk and sat there for probably 90 seconds just staring at the ceiling. I told the COO first. He nodded, said, "Good work." Sent an email to the ownership group that evening announcing the award, and to his credit, he included my name. My team celebrated. We ordered sandwiches. It was a good day. 10 weeks later, they fired me. It was the first Tuesday of October. The COO called me into the conference room at 9 in the morning. HR was already there, That's when you know. Nobody calls you into a conference room at 9 with HR already seated and then tells you're getting a promotion. He told me that due to changes in project staffing priorities and a review of the organizational structure, my position as senior project lead was being eliminated. He used the words, "no reflection on your performance." He slid the termination letter across the table. 2-week severance, continuation of health benefits through the end of the month, a non-disparagement clause they wanted me to sign, and a request to return my laptop and badge by end of day. I asked him directly, "Is this related to the bridge program I just brought in?" He said the decision was structural. I asked who would be taking over the management of that contract. He said that would be determined by the team. I didn't sign anything that day. I said I'd need time to review the documents. HR said that was fine. They'd follow up by end of week. I went back to my office, packed my personal items into a bag, not a box. I had my bag with me, and I drove home. In my car, sitting in the parking garage for about 10 minutes before I started the engine, I thought about two things. The first was my team, 11 people, some of whom had been with me for years, who would now be reporting to someone who didn't know their names last month. The second thing I thought about was a clause in my employment agreement that I had negotiated when I was hired and which had been renewed, verbatim, in my last contract revision 2 years prior. I had negotiated it myself, leveraging that contract law minor I'd almost not taken. The clause was straightforward. If I was terminated without cause within 90 days of the execution of a major contract, defined in the agreement as any single contract exceeding $15 million in total value, I was entitled to a project transition bonus equal to 2% of that contract's total value. The intent, when I negotiated it, was to protect myself from exactly this kind of scenario, bringing in a large piece of business and then being cut loose before the revenue materialized. 2% of $62 million is $1,240,000. I called my brother-in-law that evening. He's an employment attorney, not the kind who does big corporate litigation. He mostly handles wrongful termination and wage claims. But he knew enough to tell me immediately that what I was describing was worth taking seriously. He asked me to scan and send him the full contract before he said anything else. I had a copy in my home files. I had always kept a copy in my home files. He called me back 2 hours later. His voice was different, more careful, more deliberate. He said the clause was valid, it was clearly written, and the circumstances appeared to meet the conditions exactly. He said I should not sign anything Beridian had sent me. He said I should not communicate with them further without going through counsel. And then he said he was going to refer me to a colleague who handled these cases at scale, because this was beyond his usual territory. I want to be honest, the days that followed were not triumphant. They were quiet and strange. I'd been at that company for 9 years. I knew where they kept the extra printer paper. I knew which parking spots had bad drainage in the rain. I knew the names of the receptionists' kids. Losing a job like that isn't just a loss of income. It's a loss of a place you belong to, whether you wanted to or not. I drove by the building one morning without meaning to. I don't know why I did that, but I also started paying attention. A colleague of mine, someone on my team who had been with me since year 3, called me the week after I was let go. She had heard through the office what happened. She was angry in a way that surprised me. She didn't usually show that. She told me something that clarified everything. The week after I was terminated, the COO had held a staff meeting and announced that the bridge rehabilitation contract would now be managed by a project manager who had transferred in from the Pittsburgh Ownership Group's previous firm. Someone who had never done state infrastructure work, someone whose name my colleague had never heard before my termination. The decision hadn't been structural at all. They wanted the contract, and they wanted to give control of it to their person. I was the obstacle. I relayed this to my attorney. He said it was useful context, but that we didn't need it to prevail. The contract language, he said, was sufficient on its own. What we needed to establish was, 1, that I was terminated without cause, 2, that the termination occurred within the 90-day window, and 3, that the $62 million contract met the definition of major contract under the agreement. All 3 were clearly true. The termination letter itself said the decision was structural and made no reference to performance. The date was documented. The contract value was public record. He sent Meridian's legal team a formal demand letter in late October. I did not hear anything from the company directly during this period, not from the COO, not from HR, not from anyone I'd worked with for 9 years, with 2 exceptions: my former colleague on my team, who checked in occasionally, and one other person from the contracts department who sent me a brief message saying she was sorry about what happened and that she hoped I landed somewhere good. I appreciated both of them more than I said at the time. Meridian's attorney responded to the demand letter after about 3 weeks. Their position, initially, was that the termination did qualify as for cause, that there had been documented performance concerns. This was, to put it plainly, not true. I had never received a written warning. I had never been placed on a performance improvement plan. My last formal review, 8 months prior, had rated me exceeds expectations in 4 of 5 categories. My attorney requested the performance documentation they claimed existed. They produced nothing substantive, a handful of internal emails that referenced fit and team dynamics, and contained nothing that would meet a legal standard for cause. Their second position, after that fell apart, was that the clause itself was not applicable because the contract had not yet been executed in the way the agreement defined it. They argued the award notification was not equivalent to a signed contract. My attorney had anticipated this. He had the actual executed agreement documents from the state authority, which were signed and dated in August, 6 weeks before my termination. There was no ambiguity. Negotiations took about 2 months. I won't walk through every exchange because most of it was procedural, letters, responses, requests for documentation, counterpositions. What I'll say is that my attorney was steady throughout. He had done this before. He told me early on to stop checking my email every hour waiting for updates and to go do something else with my time. That was good advice. I started running again. I let that go over the past couple of years. I cooked more. I called my parents more than I had in years. My mother didn't know all the details, just that I was in a dispute with a former employer and she called every Sunday to check in. I didn't tell her the dollar amount. She worries. In December, Meridian's legal team indicated they were prepared to discuss settlement. The final amount settled on was $1,150,000, slightly below the full clause calculation. But my attorney explained that taking the matter to litigation would have added a year or more to the timeline and considerable additional expense. The settlement was reached without admitting any wrongdoing on their part, which is standard, and included a mutual non-disparagement agreement. I signed the settlement documents on a Thursday afternoon in December. My attorney emailed me when the funds cleared. I was in my kitchen making coffee. I sat down at the table and stared at my phone for a long time. I want to say something about my colleague, the one who called me the week after I was let go. She never testified, never formally provided a statement, never put herself at risk in any way. She just told me what she knew as a friend. When the settlement was done, I sent her a card. I didn't write anything dramatic in it, just that I was grateful, and that I hoped things at the company were going all right, and that she should reach out if she ever needed anything. She texted me a week later to say she was leaving Meridian. She had found something better. I told her that sounded right. I also sent a note to the woman in the contracts department who had reached out early on. She didn't do anything, she just said she was sorry. But that matters when things are hard, more than people realize. The COO, as far as I know, is still in his role. The bridge rehabilitation program is ongoing. I have no idea how it's going. That's not my information to have anymore, and honestly, I stopped wanting it. What I did with some of what I received is this. I took a 3-month break. Real, deliberate time away. I finished a continuing education course I'd been putting off for 2 years. I helped my sister move into a new apartment. I read books I'd been meaning to read since my 20s. I slept without alarm most mornings. And then I went back to work, not for another firm, but on my own. I registered an LLC in the spring. I do infrastructure consulting now, mostly advising smaller municipalities on contract procurement and project oversight. My first client was a county engineering department in Indiana. The work is steady. I set my own hours. I don't have a parking spot with bad drainage. The thing people always ask when I tell them what happened is whether I was angry. And I think about that question every time, because the honest answer is complicated. I was angry, yes. Not at the termination itself, or not only at that. I understood, by the time it was over, that the decision was purely economic and political and had nothing to do with me as a person. What I was angry about was the assumption that I hadn't read my own contract, that I wouldn't know what it said. that I would sign the papers they slid across the table and walk out of that building with 2 weeks severance and no further recourse. I'd been at that company for 9 years. I had brought in $62 million, and the thing that undid them in the end was a clause I negotiated in the second week of my employment because I had once, on a whim, signed up for a contract law elective that met at noon. They forgot that I read things carefully. They had known me for 9 years, and somehow they forgot that. I don't think about them very much anymore. I think about the work and the people I work with now, and the next thing on my list for the morning. I think about the running I started back up in the fall, and whether I'll keep it through the winter this time. I think I will. There's a version of this story where I walk out of that conference room, sign the papers they slid across the table, and go home with 2 weeks severance and a lot of quiet bitterness. That version exists. It was available to me. A lot of people take it, not because they're weak, but because they're exhausted, or because they don't know there's another version, or because nobody told them that what's written in a contract actually means something. I think about the 9 years I spent at that company, the late bids, the early flights, the client relationships I built from nothing, and I don't regret any of it. What I do think about is the assumption they made, that I wouldn't check, that I hadn't read carefully, that the person who negotiated a $62 million contract somehow hadn't read his own employment agreement. That's the part that still sits with me. Not the termination, the assumption. What carried me through wasn't anger. Anger is useful for about 48 hours, and then it starts costing you more than it gives you. What carried me through was something simpler and slower. I knew what I had done, I knew what I had signed, and I knew what I had signed, and I knew what the documents said. That's it. That's the whole thing. Integrity, in the plainest sense, not as a performance, not as a value you post on a wall, but as the actual practice of being someone who does what they said they would do and keeps records of it. I kept my copy of the contract. I kept it because I respected the agreement I had made. That same respect is what gave me standing to enforce it. I also want to say something about my colleague, the one who called me that first week. She didn't have to do that. She took a small risk in doing it, even just the risk of involvement, of being associated with someone on the wrong side of a decision the company had already made. She did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. That kind of moral clarity, knowing what's fair and acting on it even when it's inconvenient, is rarer than it should be, and it mattered more than she probably knows. And my brother-in-law, who took my call that evening, read the contract and told me honestly what he saw. He didn't inflate my chances. He didn't protect my feelings. He told me the truth, referred me to someone who could help me properly, and stepped back. That's what real support looks like, not what you want to hear, what you need to hear. The discipline it took to stay quiet during those months, to not reach out to former colleagues, to not make a scene, to let the process work. That was harder than the legal strategy. Endurance is a skill you build in the small moments, and I had been building it for years without knowing that's what I was doing. I think the reason this story ends the way it does is not luck. It's the accumulation of small, unglamorous choices made over a long time, studying something I didn't need yet, keeping files I hoped I'd never use, staying in a job long enough to know its details better than the people who ran it. None of those things felt significant when I was doing them. They felt like habits. But habits are what you have when things go sideways and there's no time to build something new. I started my own practice in the spring. The work is quieter. I know who I'm working for and why. Most mornings I get to decide what the day looks like. That's not nothing. That's actually most of what I ever wanted.